I'm delighted to be with you here tonight, with your fine rabbi, whom I almost knew when he began his rabbinate in Wisconsin, and of whom I had heard through Bob and others, and in whose congregation I am delighted to be here tonight and to celebrate Shabbat with you. But when I am speaking with you tonight, I really want to start with a sort of a confession. I want you to know that whenever I talk about the subject that I chose for tonight, I have a certain degree of discomfort that actually almost grows into pain. And if you ask me why I'm continuing to talk about this subject when it's so uncomfortable for me and even painful, then in the words of my good friend Elie Wiesel, I simply can't do anything else but try to be a witness for those who can no longer speak and can no longer give testimony for themselves. For my friends, you who are sitting here tonight on this Shabbat, and I have both the privilege and the assignment, the mitzvah, if you will, of having to be their voices. For it is very easy to forget and to let silence sweep over the events of the past. There is a problem I have with the very subject title. I used to be a member of a committee that was in charge of trying to design the contents of the Holocaust Museum of the United States on the Mall in Washington. It was our task before the building was even erected to try to figure out what items should go into the collection in order thereby to commemorate the Holocaust. And as you know, it is known the world over as the Holocaust Museum. It has attracted more people and more visitors than almost any institution in the world of any sort of this kind. And to this day, over 90% of its visitors are non-Jews. So that this Holocaust Museum, which has been established by act of Congress, is of course an enormous reminder, a continuous witness to the events earlier in the last century. There is a problem, however. I once gave a lecture in a small town in Iowa, Dubuque. You might not even have heard about the name, in a Protestant seminary there. And when I was finished, one of the faculty stopped me and said, I want you to know with some pride in his voice that I think I'm the one who discovered the word Holocaust as the word by which to designate and denote what had happened to the Jews in the 40s of the last century. I thought about it when I heard it, and it occurred to me that to him this was quite a natural sort of transfer, for he knew, of course, the Greek translation of the Bible, known as the Septuagint, which was done in the last decades of the third pre-Christian century in Egypt. And there, scholars translated the Torah and the Tanakh into Greek, thereby making it available to the entire then cultural world of its time. And they used the Hebrew word from the book of Leviticus, olah, and translated it quite correctly as Holocaustos. a total burning up, because among the many offerings that we Jews, our ancestors, brought to God in the temple in Jerusalem, there was one that was allowed to be burned up totally until only ashes remained. And that was the Olah offering, and the Greek translation is quite correctly Holocaustos. And so I can understand how this Christian Protestant scholar thought that he had caught on to the exact term from the traditional vocabulary by which to explain to the Christian world for sure what had happened to the Jews in the 40s in Nazi Europe. The only trouble with it is, isn't it, that Olah was a free will offering, a gift by Jews to God. And surely we Jews were no burnt offering to God in the Nazi period. So this whole designation of Holocaust is a terrible mistake, is almost on the nature of an insult, if one understands its origins and its true meanings. So some of us, having come to the conclusion that it was really a word that we ought not to use, looked for another term. And we found that in the Torah, in the Tanakh, there was a term called the Shoah, a terrible, devastating storm. And so most Jewish scholars today use the term Shoah instead of Holocaust. But I must tell you, and while I use the word Shoah myself, simply because there's no other, it is an inadequate term. It cannot possibly begin to give us an understanding of what happened these 70 years ago. The fact is then, my friends, that we are dealing with an event in history, not a fable, not a myth, but an event in history that has been totally demonstrated and authenticated in millions of documents for which there is no term. And the explanation is, of course, simple. The event has no precedent in human understanding or memory. There is nothing we humans have ever spoken of that comes even close to denoting what happened to our fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, our whole families, our whole communities in those horrendous years in the 40s of the last centuries. So we have a real problem. We are talking about an event that is unspeakable, for which there is no word that adequately connotes it. I wish that were the only problem. The real problem, of course, is much more profound. And that is the question, how could whatever this was, Holocaust, Shoah, whatever, someday somebody will invent a term maybe to designate it properly. How could that happen in a world that was supposed to be governed by a God? Where in the world was God during that Shoah? Where possibly was God when 6 million Jews, men, women, 1.5 million children under 10 years of age were murdered, and not just in a temple, but in one of the most methodical, organized campaigns that the human mind had ever devised, involving hundreds of thousands of participants of every type. Where was God? Where was God? I've had to ask that question of myself when I conducted services in a congregation and read the words of the Siddur. They are totally inadequate. They in no way reflect what has happened to us. They cannot possibly speak to that deepest of all pains. Where was God? And you know that, of course, I'm not the only one who asked that question. Almost every thinking Jew has asked that question in one form or another in the last 60, 70 years, and the question hasn't stopped. And as is customary among Jews, there are a whole variety of attempts to answer. So let's talk about that particular answer that seems to satisfy the most traditional elements among us. I still remember the shudder that went through me when I opened my New York Times Sunday edition some years ago and saw a full-page advertisement by a group of Orthodox rabbis who said the Shoah was God's justifiable punishment of God on the sinful Jews. The Jews brought it on to themselves. We Jews are such horrendous sinners that God couldn't do anything else but try to wipe us out. I must tell you that when I read that, I felt ashamed. I almost didn't want to be a Jew if they were Jews. For they had totally forgotten some of the greatest teachings of our past. They were frozen in one kind of a posture. God is always right, and we Jews are always wrong. And whatever happens is always God's justifiable punishment and judgment, because God is the great judge of the world and of the Jewish people in particular. They never heard of Moses, who twice told God, "You can't do what you plan to do. You want to wipe out the Jews?" God twice wanted to wipe out the Jews right after Egypt. And Moses interceded and said, "God, you can't do that." And the miracle is that God said, "Solachti kidvarecha," I forgive because you, Moses, talked to me into it. So God isn't always right according to the Torah. God has a terrible temper sometimes. God becomes vehement and ferocious and unrestrained. We are surviving Jews not because of God, but because of Moses. Moses kept us alive. Moses saved us from God. I know this is shocking, because this you haven't been taught in Sunday school or wherever else you got your Jewish learning. but it is a fact. And so, these Orthodox sages who claim to be the only true Jews, who make the statement that the Shoah is God's justifiable punishment and judgment on us sinners, have forgotten that the prophet Ezekiel, for instance, said, and he spoke in the name of God, he's a prophet of God. We no longer teach that children die for the sins of their parents. Everybody only has responsibility for herself or himself. The prophet Ezekiel abrogated the second commandment that says that the children will suffer into the third and fourth generation for the sins of their parents. But these great Jewish sages claim that none of this is operative, that we Jews deserved what happened to us. So you're not surprised when I tell you that I consider this attempt to solve the question, where was God during Auschwitz, as totally unacceptable and inoperative. There was an even more radical answer that curiously was given only by one of our colleagues. He said, where was God at Auschwitz? He was dead. God had died. That's why Auschwitz was possible. There was no more God. But there used to be in Protestant theology in the 70s and the early 80s some such movement as the Death of God movement. And this colleague apparently caught wind of it and thought that that might furnish an explanation for the absence of God in the Shoah. Fortunately, he himself recanted and wrote other books in which he no longer believed in the death of God. Don't see how Jews can talk about the death of God. That belongs to a different religion, which is not ours. Well, so is there another answer? Yes, there is one. And when it was first brought to my attention, I really felt relieved. I really thought, oh yes, here is someone who really gives me a handle. Here I can say God was doing this or that, and therefore the Shoah could happen. And since this particular answer was somehow related to Martin Buber, who is my greatest inspiration for my own understanding of Judaism, whatever else I might know about it, I was taken with it. For Martin Buber and others said, in Tanakh you find an attempt to say that God could be a hiding God, the El Mistater, or if you like the Latin phrase better, the Deus absconditus. That construction says that God is as free as are we, has free will, and that God does not have to operate by any kind of schema that somebody else has imposed on God. And so God from time to time can choose to turn away, to be gone, to take a vacation. And since it has these roots in biblical texts and among the great thinkers of our time, I felt really relieved. Somebody finally given me an answer. Where was God? Well, God was the hiding God. God hid himself, and that is why unbelievable, absolute evil could run rampant. And I must really tell you, I felt that I could be again a rabbi and a Jew, thinking about and preaching about what Jews should be, how we should respond to our time, to our conditions. Until one day I asked myself, hold it, why would God hide then, when Jews were in the greatest need and danger of their entire history? What would move God to go away when 1.5 million children, babies, were being slaughtered, burned to death, used for bayonet practice? Why would God hide then? And that answer also collapsed in itself. And I must tell you, there were weeks when I really considered to quit the rabbinate. I was in a small congregation in Iowa. I felt I had really no right to confront my congregation. I couldn't really give them an answer to what I knew was one of their most painfully burning questions. Billions of prayers were said during the Shoah. Not a one was answered. Not a one was heard. How could I, as a young rabbi, have any kind of authenticity and a kind of basis on which I could teach my people how to be Jews in our days? And I struggled. There were nights when my wife would testify when I couldn't sleep and would go into my study and try to read in books and try to think things through, try to find some kind of an answer that was at least, if not total, at least sufficient. And then one day, and I don't know how, an answer came to me which for me proved enough. Where was God at Auschwitz? He was at Auschwitz. He was in Auschwitz. God was one of the victims of the Shoah. God is not the all-powerful that the Greek philosophers had spoken and dreamt about. Torah never knew about an all-powerful God. God was a sufferer. God was dying with the Jewish people. God was suffering with those who became skeletons, with the mothers who saw their babies being thrown up in the air in order to be caught on the bayonets of their pursuers. And you know, something happened to me when I found this possibility. All of a sudden then, I felt much closer to God than I ever had before. That kind of a God who was suffering, that was much more like me. That was a God whom I could understand much more, who was much closer to me than any other God that I had ever believed in before, prayed to, thought about. This was a God with whom I could empathize in a way I never had before. This was a God I could truly love. I had pity for my God. I have pity for my God even now. For when he looks at this world that he helped create with such a dream of shalom, can you imagine what God must be feeling every moment of God's being when he looks at this world as it is? God is in turmoil. God is suffering terrible pain. Of course, God could have known this before he created Adam. That was his risk. This is where God gave away his store in creating you and me. But this is a God who became understandable. This is a God to whom I could love. This is a God to whom I could say, I'll help you. I'm here for you. I don't need anything from you anymore. You've given me a world, you've given me life. I don't need anything more. You need a lot. You get almost nothing compared to what I have. You need to be helped. You need me to be your partner. You need me to stand with you, not to bow to you, but to be here and say, here I am, God, use me. I'm your Jew. You know something? When that transformation occurred to me and in me, I became an entirely different person. And my congregants sensed it. And my students sensed it. Maybe even my children. Who knows? So that terrible question, where was God during the Shoah? I would say to you, he was in it, not sovereign, sitting on some throne as a king, which is a terrible word we use in our liturgy all the time. Who cares about God being a king? God is where there is suffering, where there is misery, where there is someone in need, where there is a cry for help. And where you and I stand up and say, Hineni, here I am, use me. I am your Jew. Amen.